In Birmingham, Alabama, the year was 2010, and Marcus Jenkins lived a life marked by routine and responsibility. At 42, he was a seasoned police officer, known for his unwavering moral compass and dedication to the force. His uniform was always crisp, his demeanor calm yet authoritative. Marcus had earned the respect of his colleagues and community, but the demands of his job weighed heavily on him. Each day brought the pressure of decision-making, often in life-or-death situations, and the stress was beginning to seep into his personal life. Marcus was married to Loretta Jenkins, a 38-year-old woman with a warm smile and a heart full of compassion. Loretta had been a single mother when they met, raising her daughter, Danielle, on her own. Marcus had stepped into their lives as a stabilizing presence, and for a time, they had been a picture of blended family harmony. Loretta appreciated Marcus's sense of duty and his effort to provide for them, but she couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. He often seemed preoccupied, lost in his thoughts, and reluctant to share his burdens. Danielle Carter, Loretta's 18-year-old daughter, was navigating the complexities of young adulthood. A freshman in college, she was eager to carve out her own path. Danielle was intelligent and ambitious, but also guarded. She kept her emotions hidden behind a facade of independence, a trait she had developed during her mother's years as a single parent. While she respected Marcus, she maintained a cautious distance, uncertain about how much space she wanted to give him in her life. Her dreams revolved around leaving Birmingham, finding a career, and building a future that was entirely her own. The Jenkins household was situated in a modest yet cozy suburban neighborhood. Their home was well kept, with a small garden out front that Loretta tended to lovingly. Inside, the living room was adorned with family photos and mementos, evidence of their attempts to create a cohesive family unit. However, the warmth of the setting couldn't always mask the unspoken tensions that simmered beneath the surface. One particular evening, Marcus arrived home later than usual. His footsteps echoed in the quiet house as he entered the kitchen, where Loretta was preparing dinner. The scent of seasoned chicken filled the air, and the table was already set for three. Danielle was in her room, headphones on, immersed in her studies. Marcus's tired eyes scanned the room, and he felt a pang of guilt for the time he had been spending away from his family. During dinner, the three of them sat together, their conversation polite but subdued. Loretta asked about Marcus's day, and he offered vague responses, avoiding the details of the arrests and confrontations that had consumed him. Danielle shared a bit about her classes, though her answers were brief, hinting at her reluctance to engage fully. The atmosphere was tinged with a sense of detachment, as though they were three separate lives merely coexisting under one roof. As the meal came to an end, Marcus leaned back in his chair and glanced at Loretta. He spoke about taking a vacation, suggesting it might help them reconnect as a family. Loretta's face softened at the suggestion, her eyes reflecting a glimmer of hope. Even Danielle, who rarely showed enthusiasm for family matters, seemed intrigued by the idea. It was a rare moment of unity, a small step toward bridging the gaps that had formed between them. That night, as the house grew quiet, Marcus sat alone in the living room, staring at the framed photographs on the mantel. Images of their wedding day, Danielle's high school graduation, and family gatherings stared back at him, reminding him of what he stood to lose. He resolved to make more time for his family, to be present in their lives despite the demands of his job. For Marcus, the promise of a vacation felt like a chance to rebuild the bonds that had begun to fray. Upstairs, Loretta lay awake, reflecting on Marcus's words. She wanted to believe in his promise, to trust that things could improve. Danielle, too, lay in her room, contemplating the idea of spending more time with her family, even as she longed for the independence that college life had begun to offer her. At work, Marcus Jenkins faced an unusually tense situation. His partner, Raymond, a man known for bending the rules, accused Marcus of being overly strict and unwilling to compromise during their patrols. The accusation struck a nerve. Marcus had always prided himself on his principles, but the constant stress of his job and the growing disconnect with his partner made his workday feel heavier than usual. The arguments between them were becoming more frequent, each one chipping away at the camaraderie they once shared. By the time Marcus returned home that evening, the weight of the day was visible on his face. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the television in the living room. Loretta was in the kitchen, her movements sharp and purposeful, a silent signal of her irritation. Marcus realized too late that he had forgotten their wedding anniversary. The bouquet of flowers he had planned to bring home remained unpurchased, overshadowed by the chaos of his day. When Loretta confronted him about his forgetfulness, the tension escalated quickly. Her voice grew louder with each word, and Marcus found himself on the defensive. He tried to explain the pressures he was under, but his words only seemed to fuel her frustration. What started as a disagreement about a missed anniversary unraveled into a full-blown argument, touching on deeper issues of neglect and emotional distance. The shouting echoed through the house, loud enough for Danielle to hear from her room upstairs. Feeling cornered and unable to calm the storm, Marcus grabbed his jacket and walked out the door. The night air was cool, and the quiet streets of the neighborhood offered a stark contrast to the heated argument he had just left behind. He needed to clear his head, to find some semblance of peace before returning home. Later that evening, Marcus reported for his night shift. The city's underbelly came alive after dark, and the calls they responded to were a harsh reminder of the world he worked to protect. During a routine patrol, Marcus and Raymond came across a group of women working on the street. They were rounded up for questioning and placed in the back of the patrol car. Among them was Cassandra, a striking woman in her late 20s with a sharp wit and an air of confidence that stood out. Her charm was disarming, and her ability to connect with people on a personal level made her memorable. As Marcus drove to the station, Cassandra engaged him in conversation, her tone alternating between playful and serious. She spoke of her struggles, painting a picture of a life filled with hardship and survival. Something about her words resonated with Marcus, though he couldn't explain why. She seemed to see through his stoic exterior, tapping into the loneliness and frustration he rarely admitted to himself. When the paperwork was delayed at the station, Cassandra suggested they continue their conversation elsewhere. Against his better judgment, Marcus found himself agreeing. They ended up at a small, unremarkable motel on the edge of town. What began as a conversation spiraled into something much more. Marcus, worn down by the stresses of his life, succumbed to a moment of weakness. For a brief time, he allowed himself to escape the responsibilities and expectations that weighed on him. But as the night progressed, the guilt began to seep in, an unwelcome reminder of the lines he had crossed. By the time Marcus returned home in the early hours of the morning, he was consumed by regret. Loretta was awake, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee, her expression softening when she saw him. Marcus approached her cautiously, offering an apology for the argument and his absence. His sincerity seemed to reach her, and she forgave him. They talked until the first light of dawn, reconnecting in a way they hadn't in months. That night, they retreated to their bedroom, the intimacy between them a fragile thread holding their relationship together. Marcus clung to the illusion of harmony, hoping that his transgressions would remain buried in the shadows of the night. The chapter ended with the house bathed in silence, the echoes of their earlier argument replaced by the semblance of peace. A few days had passed since Marcus Jenkins's encounter with Cassandra, and he was doing his best to push the memory into the farthest corners of his mind. He threw himself into his work and family life, trying to ignore the lingering guilt. But the fragile balance he had constructed was shattered when his partner, Raymond, confronted him in the precinct's parking lot. Raymond, always perceptive and opportunistic, held his phone in hand and showed Marcus a video. The grainy footage captured Marcus's indiscretion with Cassandra, leaving no room for denial. Raymond's smirk carried the weight of power, and his words were sharp and calculated. He laid out his ultimatum with chilling clarity. Marcus would assist him in covering up his involvement in an illegal drug operation, or the video would make its way to Loretta. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him, his sense of control slipping away. The image of Loretta's face, her trust shattered, haunted him. The weight of the blackmail began to manifest in every aspect of Marcus's life. At home, his usual calm demeanor was replaced by restlessness. He avoided Loretta's gaze, his conversations with her curt and distant. Loretta, perceptive and sensitive to his moods, grew increasingly concerned. She noticed the way his hands trembled when he thought she wasn't looking and the way his responses to her questions seemed evasive. The atmosphere in the house grew tense, the unspoken suspicions creating a rift between them. At work, Marcus struggled to focus. His colleagues noticed his distraction, though none dared to question him directly. The pressure of Raymond's demands and the fear of exposure gnawed at him. Each day, Marcus contemplated his options, but no solution seemed viable. The stress was unrelenting, and he began seeking solace in alcohol, something he had rarely done before. One evening, after an especially grueling day, Marcus returned home visibly intoxicated. Loretta had gone to bed early, tired from her own long day, and the house was quiet. The dim lighting and haze of alcohol clouded Marcus's judgment as he stumbled upstairs. His thoughts were fragmented, a chaotic mix of regret, frustration, and despair. He opened the bedroom door, believing it to be his, and collapsed onto the bed. Unbeknownst to him, he had entered Danielle's room. Danielle, startled by the intrusion, froze as Marcus muttered incoherently. The scent of alcohol on him was overpowering. Before she could react, Marcus's actions crossed a line that could never be undone. Danielle's shock quickly turned to horror, and she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The weight of the incident hung heavily in the room, leaving both of them in stunned silence. Marcus, realizing his grave mistake too late, retreated to his own room, his mind reeling with disbelief and shame. He spent the remainder of the night staring at the ceiling, his thoughts a storm of self-loathing and panic. Danielle, on the other hand, locked herself in her room, unable to process the betrayal and confusion she felt. The house, once a place of security, now felt foreign and hostile to her. The events of the night left a fissure that could not be repaired. Marcus's actions had not only compounded his existing troubles, but had also irreparably damaged the trust and safety of someone he was supposed to protect. The consequences of his mistake loomed ominously, threatening to unravel everything he had worked to build. Overwhelmed by Raymond's blackmail, Marcus Jenkins decided to take a calculated risk. Using his knowledge of departmental politics and Raymond's own questionable actions, Marcus began gathering evidence against him. Raymond had been involved in covering up drug operations for months, and Marcus had quietly taken note of the irregularities. He compiled the information and anonymously reported it to their superior officers. The subsequent investigation was swift and decisive. Faced with mounting evidence, Raymond was forced to resign, his career in law enforcement effectively over. The threat of exposure that had loomed over Marcus dissipated, leaving him with a fragile sense of relief. In the months that followed, life in the Jenkins household seemed to regain a semblance of normalcy. Marcus focused on his work, carefully avoiding any missteps, while Loretta busied herself with maintaining their home. Danielle appeared distant but functional, throwing herself into her studies and spending more time away from the house. The tension from the earlier months began to fade, and Marcus allowed himself to believe that he had managed to put the past behind him. However, the illusion of peace was shattered when Loretta began experiencing unusual symptoms. At first, it was subtle fatigue, persistent headaches, and occasional fevers. She attributed it to stress or a passing virus, but as weeks went by, her condition worsened. Reluctantly, she scheduled a medical appointment, hoping for simple answers. The results of her tests brought devastating news: she had tested positive for HIV. Loretta was stunned, unable to comprehend how this could have happened. She demanded that Marcus get tested immediately, her suspicion fueled by the cracks she had noticed in his behavior over the past year. Marcus complied, and the results confirmed her worst fears. He, too, was HIV positive. The revelation sent shockwaves through their marriage. Marcus tried to explain, offering vague excuses and claiming ignorance of how he had contracted the virus. But Loretta, devastated and betrayed, could no longer believe his words. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Loretta avoided Marcus, her silence more cutting than any argument. Marcus retreated into himself, struggling with the weight of his guilt and the knowledge that his actions had led to this point. Danielle, already withdrawn from her family, noticed the growing tension but avoided asking questions, focusing instead on her own life. The final blow came when Danielle began experiencing symptoms similar to Loretta's. Fearing the worst, she visited a doctor and underwent testing. When the results came back, confirming that she, too, was HIV positive, the fragile remnants of the family crumbled. Loretta, already reeling from her own diagnosis, was consumed with grief and rage upon learning about Danielle's condition. She confronted Marcus, demanding answers, but his silence spoke louder than words. The house that had once been a place of refuge became a battlefield of unspoken accusations and unbearable pain. Danielle moved out shortly after, unable to face either of her parents. Loretta, left alone with Marcus, began making plans to separate from him permanently. The bonds that once held them together were irreparably broken, and Marcus was left to grapple with the consequences of his choices, knowing that he had destroyed the lives of the two people he cared for most. Loretta sat alone in the living room, her mind swirling with the weight of the revelation about Danielle's diagnosis. The anger and despair she had tried to suppress came flooding back, overwhelming her. For months, she had battled the betrayal of her husband's infidelity and the devastating consequences it had brought into their lives. But knowing her daughter now faced the same grim reality was unbearable. The anguish she felt as a mother eclipsed any lingering hope of salvaging her marriage. Loretta confronted Marcus in a storm of fury and grief. She laid bare every accusation, every wound his actions had inflicted on their family. She blamed him for bringing destruction into their lives, for shattering the trust and safety she had worked so hard to provide. Marcus stood silently, his head bowed, unable to defend himself. The weight of her words pierced him deeply, but he knew they were deserved. He had no excuses left, no explanations that could undo the damage. Danielle, unable to cope with the suffocating tension in the house, made the decision to leave. She packed her belongings quietly, avoiding her parents as much as possible. Her departure was swift and without ceremony. Loretta watched her go with tears streaming down her face, her heartbreak compounded by the knowledge that her daughter was leaving not just the house, but the fragile connection they had once shared. Marcus, too, watched from a distance, knowing he had lost any chance of reconciliation with Danielle. Her silence spoke louder than any words of blame ever could. With Danielle gone and Loretta withdrawing into herself, Marcus found the walls of his life closing in. At work, the respect he once commanded began to erode. His colleagues, aware of the rumors surrounding his personal life, started to distance themselves. Whispers of his betrayal and the fallout from it spread through the precinct, making him an object of quiet scorn. Even those who had once called him a friend grew cold, their conversations with him curt and professional. The isolation extended beyond his workplace. Friends who had once invited him and Loretta to dinners and gatherings stopped calling. The network of relationships he had built over the years disintegrated, leaving him increasingly isolated. Marcus tried to carry on with his duties, but the weight of his guilt and the strain of his deteriorating reputation made each day harder than the last. At home, the silence was oppressive. Loretta, though still physically present, had emotionally withdrawn. She rarely spoke to Marcus, and when she did, her words were clipped and devoid of the warmth they once carried. She spent most of her time in her room or out of the house, seeking solace in the company of friends or at church. Marcus, left alone in the emptiness of their home, was haunted by memories of what it had once been. The laughter, the shared meals, the sense of unity, all of it was gone. As days turned into weeks, Marcus began to reflect on the choices that had led to his downfall. He thought about the man he had been, the principles he had once held dear, and the family he had worked so hard to build. It was clear to him now that his own actions had been the catalyst for everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, and the moments of weakness had all accumulated into the catastrophe that now defined his life. Marcus spent his evenings sitting in the dimly lit living room, staring at the family photos that still adorned the walls. The images of smiling faces and happy memories served as a painful reminder of what he had lost. He understood that the family he had once cherished was irreparably broken, and the blame rested squarely on his shoulders. In the absence of his family and friends, Marcus found himself utterly alone. The weight of his choices and the consequences they had wrought became an inescapable burden. He realized that no apology, no gesture of atonement, could undo the damage. The life he had built was gone, destroyed by his own hands, leaving him to confront the ruins in solitude. A year had passed since Marcus Jenkins's life had unraveled. The house where his family once lived together now stood eerily quiet, stripped of the warmth and liveliness it once held. Loretta had filed for divorce shortly after Danielle left, and the process was finalized within months. She and Danielle moved to another city, seeking a fresh start far from the memories that haunted them. Marcus remained behind, alone with the echoes of his past. The routine of his days had become monotonous, a cycle of work and solitude broken only by his newfound dedication to the church. Marcus began attending services regularly, seeking solace and redemption in the sermons and prayers. The words of forgiveness and grace offered a small comfort, though he often felt unworthy of them. The church became his refuge, a place where he could sit in silence and reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. Outside of church, Marcus sought to channel his guilt into action. He started volunteering with local charities, assisting in food drives and community outreach programs. He hoped that by helping others, he might find a way to atone for the pain he had caused. The work brought him moments of clarity and purpose, but it could not erase the emptiness that lingered within him. Every kind act he performed felt like a drop in the ocean of regret that consumed him. His relationship with his colleagues remained strained. Though the rumors and judgments had faded with time, Marcus still felt the distance they maintained. He no longer sought their camaraderie, content instead to focus on his duties and avoid unnecessary interactions. His life had become a solitary journey, one marked by quiet reflection and a growing acceptance of his isolation. One evening, as he sat alone at his kitchen table, Marcus decided to write a letter to Danielle. He had thought about reaching out to her many times over the past year, but had always hesitated, unsure of what to say. This time, he felt compelled to put his thoughts into words. He poured his heart into the letter, expressing his remorse for the pain he had caused and his deep regret for betraying her trust. He acknowledged his failures and the consequences of his actions, asking for forgiveness not out of expectation but as a way to unburden his soul. The letter was long and heartfelt, filled with memories of happier times and the hopes he once had for their family. Marcus sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning, unsure if Danielle would even read it. Days turned into weeks, and no response came. The silence was not unexpected, but it still cut deeply. He realized that some wounds could not be healed, and some relationships could never be mended. As Marcus sat alone in his living room, the letter's lack of response served as a painful reminder of the permanence of his mistakes. The photos on the mantel, now dust-covered and slightly faded, were all that remained of the life he once had. He understood that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on Danielle's terms, not his. Until then, All he could do was continue his quiet efforts to make amends in whatever small ways he could. The story of Marcus Jenkins ended not with redemption or reconciliation, but with the quiet acceptance of his reality. His life was a testament to the fragility of trust and the far-reaching consequences of betrayal. Though he sought forgiveness, he knew that some things, once broken, could never be fully restored.